One terrific insight we have with the Kelly papers now that he not only just does their portraits, but he captures their mannerisms, the way they move, the way they spoke. Grant, Kelly said, had a tick of opening and closing his palm, his hand, almost like a twitch. Grant warmed to Kelly, became more cooperative, and they talk art, they talk history. And one interesting thing I remember Grant saying to Kelly when they're discussing Grant's history, military history, goes, Kelly, what I'm about to tell you, you won't find it in history, as I've never mentioned it before.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. The Civil War. Those who have studied the Civil War know that at some point it takes over your memory of what happened, even though you were born in the 20th century. We spend time, those of us with the fever, talking about units and angles and shots and things that could have happened. One wonderfully rich conversation is thanks to William B. Styple, whom I welcome for his book, Generals in Bronze, interviewing the commanders of the Civil War. Bill and I met by accident, serendipity, the way all battlefields turn out, at the Gettysburg Museum next to the battlefield in July of this year. And Bill's book is a revelation, not of the battlefield itself, but of the memories of the battlefield by the men who were there, the generals in particular. And their memory becomes a record thanks to the quick sketch artist and illustrator, James Kelly. We have these notes because of Bill's very careful assembly of the documents that were left and never published in the 19th century or the 20th. Bill, congratulations. Generals in Bronze is a treasure of dialogue and at the same time an illustration cavalcade of drawings by one man, James Kelly, born 1855 in New York City. Who was he? What do we need to know about him before we go to his conversations with the aged Union and Confederate generals? Good evening to you.
Thanks for having me on, John. James Kelly, born in 1855 in New York City, uh, too young to be a soldier in the Civil War, but nevertheless interested, mesmerized by the troops marching off to the battlefields from New York. He witnessed the literally troops marching past the doorstep of his home. And also, he was very interested in art as a young age. He pored over those illustrated newspapers of the day, like Harper's Weekly and Frank Leslie's illustrated newspapers, which depicted glorious battle scenes. And he would, as a child, reproduce these scenes by drawing on his slate at school. And he soon developed a real talent drawing.
That talent was of interest to his mom and then eventually his dad. And there was a style in the 19th century of apprenticeship. It certainly dominated the life of men who were very successful later. In other words, you didn't go to college. You apprenticed at a very young age, often 14, 12, 15. And his father apprenticed him to different artisans. And then eventually he was taken up by the quick drawing department of, was it Harper's or Scribner's? I can't recall.
The first paper he was involved was the Harper's publications, which was there was a Harper's Weekly and there was also a Harper's Monthly magazine. And in those days, again, you could not reproduce photographs in newspapers, and a drawing would have to be made and then drawn onto a block and engraved on a block and then printed from the block. So it was a long process. And Kelly developed really an early great skill in drawing these illustrations on the block for the engravers.
His style, to note here, was distinctive at the time. It's very precise and carefully done so that you get a sense of the field, not just one person, but the field. What we're keen on is work of the heads and profiles of these aging generals as they talked. As I understand it, it's a revelation that we have these documents. So a detail about, Bill, your work with your colleagues. Where are the documents today that you brought to light?
Kelly's interview notes are in several locations. One at the Art Institute of the Smithsonian in Washington, the New York Historical Society in New York City. And Kelly also, not only did he interview and sketch generals, he also did some naval heroes, admirals, and some of Kelly's work, naval heroes, are at the Naval Academy in Annapolis.
There are lots of drawings, and you have some reproduced in your book, Generals in Bronze. Is there any one place for all the artwork? Is it online anywhere, Bill?
Uh, this is not his entire collection. The Smithsonian has some on their website. The New York Historical Society has some. That These are even various stages of the artwork: preliminary sketches, rough sketches, we'll call it, and then developing those rough sketches into a more pleasing picture, and then the final engraving. Kelly's artwork can be seen to this day in back issues of Harper's Weekly and Monthly and Scribner's Magazine. There isn't a single depository of his artwork. You literally have to puzzle it together.
Let's go to work. His childhood hero and the man he meets at the Fifth Avenue Hotel. His name is Sheridan, about as famous as you can get in the history of the United States. But Kelly is bold and he wants to sketch a Sheridan. And the dialogue is reproduced in Bill's book. I got the sense right away, as if I was reading a novel, that Sheridan warmed to him right away, almost as a father to a son. Was that your impression of that first meeting?
Kelly was an admiring student of Sheridan's military career, and was Kelly was introduced to Sheridan by a former staff officer of General Sheridan. It was a neighbor of Kelly's. His name was Captain William Alexander, who introduced Kelly, and Sheridan and Kelly became fast friends. And Kelly made several illustrations of Sheridan. Most famously was a bronze statuette entitled Sheridan at Cedar Creek, one of the great moments of Sheridan's career. And Sheridan actually used one of Kelly's illustrations for the cover of his memoirs. And that just shows how much Sheridan respected Kelly's art.
That first meeting, there was a sword in the room, and Kelly asked to sketch it, and Sheridan gave him permission because, as I understand, there was controversy as to whether Sheridan was wearing a sword the day he rode before the Confederate forces at Cedar Creek and rallied his troops. This kind of detail was important to Kelly always, and he talked about how their noses were bent this way or that way. An extraordinary amount of detail. Is that throughout all of his papers, not just the ones I have here, but everywhere that almost annoyingly fastidious detail?
Everything in Kelly's art had to be documented. From the great battles of the war down to the buttons on a uniform or the sword that a general might have carried. Kelly is not going to leave anything to the imagination. He had to document it. So, in doing this illustration, and the statuette of Sheridan at Cedar Creek, he wanted to know what type of sword Sheridan carried at Cedar Creek, and Sheridan happened to have this sword and showed it to Kelly, and a detailed sketch was made. And of course, then Kelly has to have General Sheridan approve of the sketch, sign it. This is the sword that I carried at Cedar Creek. So Kelly was very much into protecting his art by documenting it and doing these interviews with these famous generals. Was an important moment in Kelly's boyhood dream, of course, but then as an artist to get the art correctly done.
One scene again and again that Kelly returns to, and he talks about it with Sheridan, is the surrendered Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865. Sheridan was there, present. He had been leading the cavalry corps and chasing Lee's people all the way from Petersburg. But Sheridan didn't see the actual surrender. He fell asleep under a tree. Do I remember that
Yeah,
correct?
that is correct. Kelly was commissioned to do a picture of the surrender at Appomattox, and he approached General Sheridan and said, "General Sheridan, you're always figured prominently in the room. Where exactly did you stand?" And Sheridan replies, "Kelly, I would like to be in your picture, but I never set foot in the room. I was outside asleep under a tree." When they all had arrived at the McLean house for the surrender, they shook hands all around, and Sheridan remarked to the other generals, "I've been 10 days in the saddle. I'm exhausted." He laid down under a tree, fell asleep, and did not wake until he looked up and saw Lee descend the airways.
There was a light rain falling, and when Lee came out, is it Sheridan who remembers him red in the face? Is that Sheridan's memory?
That's Sheridan's memory of the event. Yeah, and of course, then Kelly made a preliminary quick sketch of Sheridan waking up, rising up on an elbow, and looking up and seeing Lee and Traveler, uh, the horse, and that's what makes Kelly's work so interesting. That his attention to detail, getting the scene right, even if it sacrificed General Sheridan in the room, Kelly, he wouldn't do something that wasn't right.
William Tecumseh Sherman, the wingman to General Grant in the march from down to Vicksburg, and then the decision made by Lincoln to bring Grant back to the Army of the Potomac. And Sherman goes on to the march to the sea and then swing up through South Carolina and North Carolina to the end of the war. We're keen on Sherman's meeting with Kelly because this is a completely different personality than William Sheridan. Sherman was abrupt. He was cranky. He was always either in the saddle or in anger. And Kelly finds a way to charm him and to get him to move and twist. Do I remember that correctly, Bill? He had Sherman stand up, sit down while he sketched his head.
But you have to remember, William Tecumseh Sherman had little time for reporters, newspapermen, and that sort. Uh, of all the generals, close to 50 generals that Kelly met with and sketched or painted or sculpted, Sheridan held back somewhat. He wasn't as forthcoming with Kelly. He does warm to Kelly, and they do have conversations about the march to the sea and various events in Sherman's military career. But you can see that Sherman did hold back somewhat, but it makes it really more human than some of the biographers and whatnot. He was. Again, warm to Kelly later on, but difficult to come around at start.
I never believed the quote, if nominated, I will not run, if elected, I will not serve, about Sherman refusing the presidential nomination by the Republican Party. I never believed it until now. Sherman was so cranky all the time at the Fifth Avenue Hotel. Now, Sherman also is a man who could remember battles that he does not. Where does Kelly get those battles from? I'm thinking of Fort Donelson, Vicksburg, and then eventually the Wilderness Campaign. He gets them from Grant himself. He finally meets Grant many years later after the presidency. I think the first time they meet is 1880, is my memory,
1880. Yeah.
in the Fifth Avenue Hotel. And Grant is completely surprising to me. Soft hands, a very gentle man. Was Kelly surprised?
One terrific insight we have with the Kelly papers now that he not only just does their portraits, but he captures their mannerisms, the way they move, the way they spoke. Grant Kelly said had a tick of opening and closing his palm, his hand, almost like a twitch. And though again, Grant warmed to Kelly, became more cooperative, and they talk art, they talk history. And one interesting thing I remember Grant saying to Kelly when they're discussing Grant's history, military history, goes, "Kelly, what I'm about to tell you, you won't find it in history, as I've never mentioned it before." And so that's how these generals would open up to Kelly. They actually, to me, it seemed they enjoyed sitting for their artists and talking about their past glory. And some generals, again, weren't so cooperative. maybe like Sherman, but Sherman's subordinate generals had a lot to say about him, which I found very interesting.
Yes, staying with Grant. Again, the scene at Appomattox Courthouse. There was a detail that there were two tables, Grant at one, Lee at the other. So Kelly asked Grant, what about the table? How big was it? So Grant says, about the size of this, a little less, about the size of this room, a little less, one table. They go through the details from Grant's point of view. To my knowledge, that information doesn't exist anywhere else. Have you ever heard anybody write into you
Well,
say, where did
that
where did Kelly get the nerve to ask Grant about the room?
yeah, that again, that's Kelly's attention to detail. Grant said that the document was signed at one table. They sat at different tables, possibly, but it was he remembered it signed at one table. And really, the interesting story is Ely Parker, who was Grant's military secretary during the surrender at Appomattox at the McLean House. And Kelly interviewed Ely Parker, and Parker said, "I don't know if you want to use this, Kelly, for your picture." Grant had a cigar in his mouth the entire time.
There's a meeting the next day that I did not know existed, where Grant and Lee meet on horseback at a stream that is a division between the two forces, with their officers standing back. Did Kelly sketch that scene?
Not that I know of. He could very well be, but a lot of Kelly's material is lost or in archives that have yet to be discovered. I'm sure he did some preliminary sketches of that moment, but I have not located it so far.
And what's important to me is what they exchanged, because nobody was listening. Grant, according to Grant, would have an aide with a folio rush up. He would sign a document and send it off, but we have no knowledge of that conversation between them. Have you seen it reported anywhere from Lee's?
I believe that was a private conversation. It could very well have been about the rations that were going to be sent to these men who were starving. We know the story that Grant issued double the ration for his men so that no one would go hungry.
Right. The Army of Virginia, Northern Virginia, was on the run for days, and they had not been able to even have a warm meal for days. And the Union was filled with provisions coming out from the lines. Joshua T. Chamberlain. Joshua Chamberlain, later president of Bowdoin College, later governor of Maine, hero to everyone, dying in 1914. I believe he's listed as the last man wounded in the Civil War to die of his wounds, the wounding at Petersburg. Joshua Chamberlain is a scholar. He's an intellectual. He's a surprising personality given that day in Gettysburg. The question that always comes to mind is, how did they hold the line at Little Round Top? It wasn't until I stood on Little Round Top that I understood the climb that Hood's men had coming up, detail that you don't get from an overhead map. However, there was a controversy that day, and I want to explore it only momentarily because Kelly touches upon it several times. These men who were generals, living and dead afterwards, would argue forever. The ghosts would argue with the living would argue with each other about who said what. There are many visions of those days. There's a man named Gouverneur Warren who was a commander, a general on the day of Gettysburg. Warren is the one who told Chamberlain, get up there. Don't pay attention to your orders to go there. You have to get up there because that's the left flank of the whole Union Army. And Warren becomes extremely important to Chamberlain. But there's an incident at the Battle of Five Forks. This is as Lee flees Petersburg, in which General George Meade relieves, I believe it's Meade, no, perhaps it's another person who relieves Warren afterwards. And it becomes important to Sheridan to denounce Warren as shy, I believe. That would have been the 19th century word. Your opinion of this controversy, which dances through these pages, and the prosecution continued until the 1880s, and Chamberlain would testify for Warren, and others would testify for Sheridan, and Sheridan wouldn't back out. It's like a subplot for your book, Bill. Do you have an opinion of what
Yeah.
happened?
Well, Kelly was present at the Warren Court of Inquiry there in New York City. It took place after the war. Warren was trying to, let's more or less clear his name for being relieved of command at the Battle of Five Forks. And it was a military hearing, and there were many testimonies pro and anti-Warren, and Warren did get more sympathy, I believe, toward after the war, and he was exonerated for let's say being shy at the Battle of Five Forks, slow. But Sheridan was the one that relieved Warren, and it became really a stain on Warren's long military career, which was eventually say. And Chamberlain was also there at Five Forks, and he witnessed the battle. He's in the thick of it, and his testimony, I believe, did help Warren uh, be exonerated for slowness.
Let's look at Chamberlain's life from the point of view of Kelly sketching him, because there's a lot of attention to the wounding of Chamberlain at Petersburg, as I
Yes.
recall, when Chamberlain was ordered with his unit. It was at that point he was commanding a brigade, more than one regiment, and he was wounded carrying the colors, his command colors, walking forward into a line of Confederate fire. Now, it always struck me that those orders were bloody minded, Bill. How did it strike you? There was no cover. They were walking straight into massed guns.
Yeah, that was typical of the Civil War, frontal assault, an infantry assault, lines of men approaching other lines of men. Sometimes the other men would be entrenched. And when Chamberlain's brigade was ordered to carry those trenches, Chamberlain led the way, carrying the colors. Was shot through the lower body, the bullet entering one hip, exiting the other, hitting vital organs, and Chamberlain tells Kelly that he had to use his sword as a tripod to keep himself standing, and seeing himself bleed. And Chamberlain thought, what he tells Kelly, he goes, "That's more than a man can bleed. It's Bucky, Phil buckets full. We're leaving him." But he was saved, and the wound eventually recovered to take further command during the war, but he suffered from it for the rest of his life. And they say it was the cause of death. Close to 50 years later.
Yes, there were many operations that had to happen because of the wounding of his internal organs. Staying with Chamberlain, however, the interview is a fascination because Chamberlain has opinions. For example, he reminds all of us it's Roosevelt, not Roosevelt. I like that detail. He has an opinion also of Grant and an opinion of the politics of the moment. It's a very in-depth interview with him. I've seen nothing like it comparable. Chamberlain was generous towards him. I mean, generous towards Kelly. And Kelly, at this point, he's been doing these sketches for some years. He's grown into a charmer, Bill. That's how I read these texts. Now, you've read more than I have. Was that something that's throughout the body of it? Charm.
Yeah, yes. Kelly was sincere in his admiration and his art, his dedication to his craft, and these generals respected that. And I think these generals actually enjoyed going to Kelly's studio, which was on 57th Street in Manhattan, and he had a big, comfy chair there, and these generals would sit, and in some ways, it was like therapy. They got to unload on Kelly and tell Kelly some of those stories that they would not put in their memoirs. Chamberlain does have some criticisms of the government during the war, and he comments to Kelly that one day he should write the dark history of the war. It would astonish people. And Kelly says, General Chamberlain, you should do it. You must do it. But he didn't. Chamberlain did not write that kind of book back then. You didn't write tell all. If you had a criticism of Lincoln, you did not put that in your memoirs. He's the martyred president. You would not write it in your memoirs. They would perhaps talk about it, but they would not write about it. And
Abner Doubleday. Back to the Gettysburg battlefield, Bill. This is tense. Let's not go into too much detail. But it's tempting. Okay. Reynolds is commander of the First Corps. Buford the day before, the 30th of June into the morning of the 1st. Buford is commanding a cavalry division, and he has parts of it with him at Gettysburg, which is the spokes of a wheel. All the roads lead into Gettysburg. Buford has a sense that the Confederate Army is coming up that road from Chambersburg and sends a runner to Reynolds to get the lead of the Army of the Potomac to get up here by the morning, or we're going to lose the whole advantage we have. Reynolds is the hero of everyone, commanding the First Corps. But it's Reynolds who gets so close to the battlefield in the wood to the left of flank of what becomes the battlefield that he's shot in the neck, is the detail Abner Doubleday reports, in the neck, and is dead immediately on the ground. Doubleday, commanding a subordinate, commanding a division in the First Corps, is now senior on the field, if I remember. But this was controversial. How so, Bill? And how did they resolve it years later? Were they still talking about it?
they talked about it till the end of their lives. And Doubleday was thrust into that position. He did not seek command of the First Corps, but suddenly you find yourself in command of a corps where you might not even know where the brigades are located on a battlefield. And, Doubleday, I believe, did his best. It was his First Corps was forced to retreat, and it was more of an orderly retreat compared to the 11th Corps, which was north of the town of Gettysburg. That corps, commanded by General Howard, they were pushed back through the town. We'll call it helter skelter, only to rally on Cemetery Hill, which General Howard had the foresight to leave some troops there as a fallback position, and it worked.
Yes, and then Hancock comes up and challenges Doubleday seniority and takes over, and that remains the controversy. I understand it sounds petty, but it's a wonderful detail of what happens with your your army being cut up all around you. You have no sense of where Lee is, or that there's a whole Confederate corps coming from the north that has broken the 11th, and they're in pell-mell through the town. And the cemetery above, it sounds like a place you don't want to make a last stand, but there it was. And it was Doubleday's genius to be keen on it. Did Chamberlain have an opinion? I don't remember him commenting on this.
Well, he was in the Fifth Corps at the time, commanding only of a regiment, the 20th Maine Infantry, and they had yet arrived at the Battle of Gettysburg. They arrived
So,
on
so
the second day.
he didn't evidence an opinion. He didn't wait.
No, he didn't. But a lot of the generals, they had to take sides when a controversy like who chose the battlefield at Gettysburg, did Meade intend on retreating, and so on. Those points are still argued to this day. What if Lee had ordered the assault on Cemetery Hill and his subordinate generals followed through, like General Ewell and Early? Had they taken Cemetery Hill on the first? Would Stonewall Jackson, if he was alive, would he have taken Cemetery Hill? I don't do what ifs, but that's the part of the interest in Gettysburg today. People still argue what happened and what could have happened.
Yes, I recommend when you find Bill at the Gettysburg Museum to walk up to him and say, "All right, what's your defense of Hancock taking possession of First Corps that first day, which saves the battle?" I'm speaking to Bill Styple. The book is Generals in Bronze, Interviewing the Commanders of the Civil War. Before we go to And the Rest of the Story, which is a second book about Lincoln's passing, with memories done by James Kelly as well. A note about Dan Sickles and the Peach Orchard. We don't get into the details, but Sickles, what a character, Bill. Is there another general like him in your memory with the storytelling he carries on for 50 years?
That's part of his fame is that people are still talking about him and his decision to advance the Third Corps to the Peach Orchard salient. Whether it was the right move or the wrong move, it's still argued today. And Sickles was a colorful figure, no doubt. He wasn't a military man. He did not go to West Point. He was a congressman who was famous before the war for murdering his wife's lover in Washington, D.C., in a public street. Sickles was tried for murder and was the first successful defense of temporary insanity that got him off of that charge. As a soldier, credited with being a fighter, but as a military tactician, maybe not so much.
One detail. I've always thought it was apocryphal that he boasted about his amputated leg hung up in glass over a bar, and he would bring his new girlfriends to see his other leg. Is that true?
That is true. During the fight at the Peach Orchard on July 2nd, a bouncing cannonball came by and hit Sickles in the leg, broke the leg so severely that necessitated an amputation. And Sickles ordered that the leg be preserved. And to this day, you can see it in Washington, D.C. on display at the Medical Museum.
To the one detail we missed with Grant, the funeral. James Kelly was there the funeral day, watching the procession. There were tens of thousands of New Yorkers gathered. The train had arrived. The coffin had arrived on the 5th. This is the 8th or 9th, I believe, of August. Extremely hot. You have a detail about a man with a carbuncle. Please explain.
Well, there was a large, huge procession with Grant's body being taken to the site of his tomb at Riverside Drive, but the procession was led by General Winfield Scott Hancock. And Kelly is a witness to the procession. He's there watching it and writing about it. He sees General Hancock on this brutally hot day, and he said Hancock was purple with sunburn. Okay. Well, the following February, General Hancock died, and on his death certificate, there's two causes of death, one being diabetes, the other is an infected carbuncle on the back of his neck. And I wonder that infected carbuncle was as a result of the horrific sunburn that General Hancock received while leading Grant's funeral procession.
A wonderful question. Again, you can ask Bill when you see him at the museum. Now, we've done Grant's tomb. We come to the book that I do not have about Abraham Lincoln. How is it arranged? This is Kelly's work as well, Bill.
Kelly, he not only interviewed generals, famous generals of the war, and he was a history buff. He would interview civilians that witnessed the Gettysburg Address or the Second Inaugural, or soldiers that might have just shook Lincoln's hand in camp. Kelly is going to interview them to get those details of that event. And so I felt Generals in Bronze, I wanted to focus on the Civil War and the generals. But I did the second volume called "Tell Me of Lincoln" because it's Kelly's interest in Lincoln. He was very interested in the Lincoln assassination, and he interviewed a dozen eyewitnesses, including Dr. Charles Leal, who was the very first surgeon to reach Lincoln in the box at Ford's Theater moments after Lincoln was shot. Dr. Leal, for the rest of his life, he would not talk about that night, not even with his family, but he does sit down with Kelly. Tell Kelly all the details about being the first surgeon to reach Lincoln. I felt this was important to history, and that's why I did the book "Tell Me of Lincoln."
Does it include the pursuit of Booth?
Yes.
And the Baker commanding the cavalry, as I recall?
Captain Doherty was the captain of the troop that actually cornered Booth and Harold in the barn in Virginia. And Kelly interviewed Doherty, but he also interviewed members of the cast of the play, Our American Cousin. And he also interviewed former soldiers that knew Boston Corbett, the man credited with shooting Booth.
So what we have is a book dedicated to Lincoln. I'm drawn back to that anecdote that Kelly tells early in his life about how people would speak against Lincoln as a man who was creating this horrible grief that had struck Manhattan. Wasn't there a woman who pretended to stab Lincoln when he was alive?
So the Kelly family were Republicans, supporters of Lincoln in a Democratic neighborhood, which was very dangerous in New York in 1864. Uh, and Kelly never wavered in his admiration of Lincoln. But Kelly well remembered the draft riots that took place in his neighborhoods.
Right.
So he was again very loyal to the Union, supporter of Lincoln, and shocked to hear that someone would actually denounce Lincoln in his presence.
Did he ever draw the draft riots that went on what 5 days after Gettysburg? Did he record that in his memory? We have
Yes, he did. He did record it in his memories, but also would interview those who fought against the rioters and
right.
or whose homes were attacked by the rioters. So Kelly again was very interested in any New York history. He even interviewed families that rented rooms to Edgar Allan Poe because
Wonderful.
Kelly wants to know what Edgar Allan Poe was like as a person. So anyone that rented rooms or knew Poe, Kelly's going to interview you.
Book is Generals in Bronze, interviewing the commanders of the Civil War. William B. Styple is the author. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.